Good evening. I am the committee chair, Kathy Kitchell, and on behalf of committee members and staff, I would like to welcome you to the February 2nd, 2021 City of Roseville Local Sales Tax Citizens Oversight Committee meeting. This 5-member committee is charged with the annual review and report to the City Council on the revenue and expenditures of funds from the General Transactions and Use Tax, known as Measure B, that was passed by voters on November 6, 2018. We are meeting via video conference to adhere to Executive Order N2920, executed by the Governor of California on March 17, 2020, and as a response to mitigating the spread of coronavirus known as COVID-19. The meeting will allow members of the public to participate and address the committee during the open session. Public comment may be submitted by telephone during the meeting and prior to the close of public comment on an agenda item by calling 916-774-5353. If you call, you may be placed on hold until the attendant can answer. The broadcast is delayed by up to 30 seconds when watching at home. When your call is transferred, you will have 3 minutes for public comment on items not on the agenda and 5 minutes in which to speak to a regular agenda item. Your time will be monitored and you will be informed when you have 1 minute left to conclude your comments. If you are listening to the meeting while calling in, please turn down the volume on the meeting in order to avoid interference. When calling, please do not use the speakerphone option as it may create difficulty for the committee to hear your comments. I will now call the meeting to order. Terry, could you please take the roll call?
Committee Member Comstock?
Present.
Committee Member Duffy?
Present.
Committee Member Kite?
Present.
Chair Kitchell?
Present.
Vice Chair Krafka?
Present.
All members are present.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
To the flag
of the United States of America,
and to the
republic for which it stands, one nation,
under God,
indivisible,
with
with liberty and justice for all.
This part of the agenda, public comment, is for anyone who would like to address the committee on any item not listed on tonight's agenda. The Brown Act does not permit action on items discussed during public comment. Staff, is there anyone who would like to address the committee on any item not on tonight's agenda? I will now open this up to public comment. Public comment may be given by telephone by calling 916-774-5353. When addressing the committee, please state your name for the record and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Any public comments at this time?
Chair Kitchell, we have no phone calls at this time, but the live stream is delayed approximately 30 seconds. So I'll wait to see if we receive any phone calls. Okay, it's been 30 seconds. We have no public comments.
Thank you. I will now close the public comment and move on to item 5, approval of minutes. This item is approval of the minutes of the February 18th, 2020 meeting of the Local Sales Tax Citizens Oversight Committee. Are there any comments from the committee? Seeing none, I will now, excuse me? Was there a comment? Nope, okay. I will now open this up to public comment. Public comment may be given by telephone by calling 916-774-5353. When addressing the committee, please state your name for the record and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Are there any public comments?
Chair Kitchell, we have no phone calls at this time, but the live stream is delayed approximately 30 seconds. So we will wait and see if we receive any phone calls. Okay, it has been 30 seconds. We have no public comments.
Thank you. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve.
And a second?
Double muted. I'll second that motion.
All those in favor say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The motion passes. Item 6, requests and presentations. Staff recommends the Local Sales Tax Citizens Oversight Committee take action to appoint a chair and vice chair for the committee to serve until December 31st, 2021.
I'm going to jump in here, Kathy, for you. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Joe Mandel from the Roseville City Attorney's Office. For those of you that I don't know yet, our meeting procedures for the Local Sales Tax Citizens Oversight Committee state that we select a chair and a vice chair every year for them to serve through the calendar year. And so since we're upon a new year, we are here to select a new chair and vice chair. So thank you, Chair Kitchell and Vice Chair Krafka, for your service. At this time, essentially what we'll do is we can open it up to nominations is how I think we can do it. And you can nominate any of the other members. You can nominate yourself. We can actually continue having the same chair and vice chair. All of that stuff is okay. But if we are wanting to move things around, we are able to do that right here. And so I think what we could do is talk about nominations and open up a nomination period, see how many nominations we have, and then move that into making a motion for nominating somebody for chair, and then doing the same thing for doing the selection of vice chair. So based on that, any questions from anybody? Because otherwise we can just open it up for nominations or...
I have a quick question, Joe.
Yes.
I was just wondering if Kathy and Megan wanted to remain in those same positions or if they do not want to go for another term.
I'm open to it, but I'm also, if anyone else would like to step up for one of the positions, I'm fine with that as well.
I agree with Megan.
It looks like Committee Member Kite, you had your hand raised. Did you have a question? He's muted.
You're on mute.
That's a new phrase in 2020. You're on mute.
Mm-hmm.
My opinion is that we haven't had an awful lot of activity that we had to do with the last year. Certainly if both of you are willing to continue to serve, I would be all for leaving things just the way they are.
Would anyone else like to put their names in for one of the positions? Seeing none, we need to ask for public comment on the item.
Yes. We'll do public comment and then we'll go into nominations or make a motion, however we're going to end up doing it.
Okay. Public comments. We're gonna know this telephone number by heart pretty soon. Public comment may be given by telephone by calling 916-774-5353. When addressing the committee, please state your name for the record and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Are there any public comments on this item?
Chair Kitchell, we have no public comments at this time, but the live stream is delayed approximately 30 seconds, so we'll wait to see if we receive any phone calls. Okay, it's been 30 seconds and we have no public comments.
Okay.
So
Any other nominations for chair of the local sales tax citizens oversight committee? Okay.
Committee member Duffy, you're on mute. I can see you talking.
He's still on mute.
Use your mouse to click the little microphone on your picture. Or on the upper right-hand corner of your screen.
Uh-oh. We lost committee member Duffy. Okay. Do you have a visual? You do. Okay. And do you have at the bottom left of your picture? Do you have a little microphone? Do you have? Is there another place for him to click to unmute himself?
On the very top right of the screen in the black bar, there's a big red box that says leave. If you go 2 over, there's a little microphone that should unmute you.
Perhaps your mouse isn't working. Is that possible? How about if you call in? Would that be all right, Joe, if he called in?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. There's also a chat feature in here that if he wants to type something, we can, I guess, read it aloud if he has comments of.
How do we get to chat?
Maybe not. Hang on.
It also looks like there might be a keystroke of Control, Shift, and the letter M. No?
Okay.
So on that same bar that we're talking about where you can turn your camera off and mute and things like that, you can say show conversation and you can start typing messages to each other in here as well.
Oh, I see it. Okay.
And that might be a way to communicate back and forth. And then we could just read it in.
Looks like a little cartoon balloon.
Well, mine is loading.
Ain't technology wonderful?
Well, it wouldn't be so bad if we were all using the same technology, but I know everybody's got different computers. Okay. All right.
Well, I see a message from Rick and he's good. He's saying his audio got dropped and we're just going to continue on. And so everything works. So we were at a point where we were either going to continue making nominations or someone would make a motion if they wanted to have somebody selected as chair and vice chair. So that's where we had left it at.
Okay. I'm going to shortcut this, if I may, and just say we had the suggestion that the current chair and vice chair continue. Is there any objection to that?
I'm going to make us do it a different way, but we can talk through it.
We need a motion.
Yeah. And basically the chair can't make a motion. So we just need somebody else to make a motion, essentially doing the same thing. But Kathy, you can second motions. So use that.
I motion that the chair and vice chair stay the same for the calendar year of 2021.
Excellent. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Okay. And so all those in favor say aye.
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 Are there any opposed to this motion? All right. Looks like the motion passes. Congratulations, Chair and Vice Chair again. This will be pretty easy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we accomplished all of item 6.1. Now we can move on to item 6.2, which is the Brown Act. Remind us of what we need to do, Mr. Mendel.
Yes, this is more fun. Thanks for that introduction. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Joe Mandel, and I'm a senior deputy city attorney for the city of Roseville. I first wanted to just start off by saying that I'm looking forward to working with all of you on this committee over the next couple of months, and I'll be attending each one of these meetings with you, along with Dennis Kaufman and Terry Bradley. So feel free to reach out and ask us any questions if you ever have any. And I'm excited to get to know those of you that I haven't worked with before. I'm doing a presentation tonight on a set of laws focused on public participation and transparency. It's commonly referred to as the Brown Act, and I'm going to explain how those laws will apply to this committee. So if you've served on a city board or commission before, then you'll be familiar with these rules, but a refresher is always nice. And the Brown Act was recently updated last year to address video conferencing of meetings and social media use by public officials, but we can get into that stuff later. So next slide. First question on everybody's mind, what is the Brown Act? So the Brown Act is an act of the California State Legislature that was authored by a gentleman named Ralph M. Brown that was passed in 1953 that guarantees the public's right to attend and participate in meetings of public bodies. So it's part of a group of sunshine laws, as they're called, that were passed in the 1950s to 1970s to ensure that certain proceedings by government agencies were open and available to the public. And so for everybody taking notes, the Brown Act starts at California Government Code Section 54950, if you happen to want to research that yourself. But the basic rule is that a majority of the members of a legislative body cannot discuss, deliberate, or take action on any matter that would go before the commission unless it's at a properly noticed meeting. So the main principles of the Brown Act are mainly about transparency and allowing public participation, as shown on this slide. So what we're seeing here is the public has the right to know what actions its elected and appointed officials are taking. The meetings must be open and not in secret, and the public has the right to participate in these public meetings. So next slide, please. What types of legislative bodies does the Brown Act apply to? It applies to governing bodies of cities or counties, such as the City Council, the Placer County Board of Supervisors, and it also applies to subsidiary bodies that were created by formal action of the City Council, such as all of the various boards and commissions that we have here at the city. I think we're up to 16 different boards and commissions, and those are all governed by the Brown Act. And so we make sure that everything is in compliance with the Brown Act. And I wanted to point out the bottom two bullets on this slide and how they apply to us. The Local Sales Tax Citizens Oversight Committee is an oversight board that was created after the voters passed Measure B, which was the half-cent sales tax increase. So that's that formal action in the second bullet. And then the third bullet, we are also a standing committee with continuing subject matter jurisdiction, and we're reviewing the revenues and expenditures associated with Measure B. So we do know that the Brown Act does apply to this committee based on that criteria. Next slide, please. Since the Brown Act applies to this committee, there's certain requirements that need to be met to adequately inform the public of any actions that are being taken. So before holding a public meeting of this committee, we needed to provide proper notice to the public and post an agenda. So with regard to proper noticing of a meeting, Regular meetings, notice needs to be posted 72 hours in advance. And for special meetings, such as when there's an emergency or something to that effect, you can post a meeting 24 hours in advance. And you note that that's in a publicly accessible place. And for Roseville, that's our libraries, the Maidu Library, Martha Riley Library, Downtown Library. We post it at the Civic Center here. We also post it online, and then it gets blasted out through all the various means online whenever we post agendas. So COVID has definitely impacted some of our procedures that we do here, and you can see, it creates some fun technological problems in our public meetings, but we're still able to hold all these necessary public meetings, and we just worked around it. And so the Brown Act allows us to get flexible in that way. So next slide, please. In addition to providing the public with prior notice, an agenda also needs to be posted. And the purpose of the agenda is to inform the public about what the commission is acting upon at the meeting. So you need to provide at every meeting an opportunity for public comment. You can't prohibit criticism. Each agenda needs to have a brief general description of each item of business that's being transacted. And importantly, no action or discussion can take place on an item not posted on the agenda. So that's really important. And part of our job in the city attorney's office is to ensure compliance with the Brown Act requirements for each one of our city boards and commissions. And so that allows you guys to focus more of your time on the subject matter and, a little less on the procedure. Next slide, please. What is technically a meeting under the Brown Act? You can see here that a meeting is defined as any congregation of a majority of the members of a legislative body at the same time and location to hear, discuss, deliberate, or take action upon any item within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. So a couple of key takeaways there are, we're talking about a majority of the members of this committee cannot at the same time and location do these things: hear, discuss, deliberate, or take any action on any items that are under the purview of this local sales tax citizens oversight committee. There's going to be some different rules that apply to social media, and you can see how we're talking about a majority of the members here, but once we get to talking about social media, it can be just, two members talking can be a problem. So I'll get to that in a moment, but I just want to point that out. And next slide, please. Probably the biggest issue these days is regarding a type of prohibited meeting called a seriatim meeting, which is really just a fancy Latin word for a series of meetings. And here the concern is that a majority of the members of this committee shall not, outside of an authorized meeting, use a series of communications of any kind, directly or through intermediaries, to discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item of business of the local sales tax citizens oversight committee. This includes email. So some of the most common types of prohibited seriatim meetings are shown right here on this slide. And one of the most common ones is the chain of communications, where member A communicates with member B, and then member B communicates with member C, and now A, B, and C are aware of each other's position, and that's a majority, and that's a Brown Act violation. Same sort of situation, but instead of it being a chain, there's also one called the hub of the wheel, where member A acts as the hub, and they're communicating individually with member B and member C, who act as the spokes. And again, that is a no-no under the Brown Act, and so you want to avoid those types of communications whenever possible. So this issue of serial meetings has become a hot topic over the last couple years due to the increased use of social media. And so you can see in these situations how you may encounter a Brown Act problem with things like emails, reply to alls, group texts, Facebook comments, Nextdoor, and other types of bulletin boards and forums and things like that. So next slide, please. You can use social media to answer questions from the public provide information to the public, and solicit information from the public on any sort of commission business. All that is okay. But here is where it gets a little tricky when we're talking about social media, and that's what the second bullet is single contacts between public officials or members on this committee would normally be okay because that's not a majority, but for social media purposes, they're focused on just 2 members. So 2 members can be a problem for Brown Act purposes on social media. After the passage of California Assembly Bill 992, which was passed in 2020 to address public officials' use of social media. And if we go to the next slide, that has some more information about AB 992. And so AB 992 prohibits members of a legislative body from responding directly to any communication on an internet-based social media platform regarding a matter that's within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body that's made, posted, or shared by any other member of the legislative body. I think that just went away. Okay. This is an important one because really, if one of you makes a comment on social media and the other one reacts to it in any way on that social media post, that's now considered a Brown Act violation under AB 992. So this bottom bullet talking about AB 992 now prohibits commenting, retweeting, liking, disliking, responding with emojis or digital icons, screenshotting, reposting, things like that. So if you are someone who's active on social media, please do not post anything in reaction to another fellow member's social media post. That's really the big takeaway that I wanted everybody to get here from the new law in AB 992. So that's the important part there. Then I can answer any questions at the end of this if you have any questions there. But despite all these restrictions on social media, there are certain individual communications that are allowed. And on the next slide is where we can talk about some of those. So these are permitted individual communications. These are all okay. So you can engage in separate communications outside of a meeting as long as you're answering questions or providing information. But the big thing is, you don't communicate to other members the comments or position of any of the other members. That's the key thing. Just don't communicate the comments or positions of anyone else. And just because you're using that bottom bullet is, just because you're using your personal email account doesn't mean it makes it any less of a public record. So note that everything you're doing is commission business and can be disclosable under the California Public Records Act. So we like to make sure everybody's doing everything and not in violation of any sort of laws at all. Next slide, please. Now that we know what is a meeting, let's look at technically what's not considered a meeting under the Brown Act. And this is a question that I get asked frequently. So you can see that a meeting is not any of the things on this page. These types of interactions amongst committee members, all of you can get together and you would not be in violation of the Brown Act. Going through the bullets real quick. If you're all at a conference that's open to the public involving a discussion of issues of general interest, no problem. That's okay. If you're at an open and publicized community meeting, I'm going to use Arcona, the Roseville Coalition of Neighborhood Associations, as an example. If you're at an Arcona meeting, that sort of meeting. The third bullet, if you're attending an open and notice meeting of another public body, that's okay. So if you're at a Placer County Board of Supervisors meeting or a Sacramento Planning Commission meeting or something like that, that's okay. A majority of you can be there and not be in violation of the Brown Act. And the final 2 bullets, one, attending a purely social or ceremonial occasion. This is the wedding, or a baby shower or something where everybody gets together and that's not a Brown Act violation. Again, just don't discuss committee business, don't discuss any positions, and everybody should be fine. So next slide, please. All right, so this is just as an FYI, but so that everybody is aware, yes, there are penalties and civil remedies associated with violations of the Brown Act. For criminal penalties to apply here, if any member who attends a meeting of this committee where an action's taken in violation of the Brown Act and where a member intended to deprive the public of information which you knew or had reason to know that the public was entitled to under the Brown Act, that's a violation and you would be guilty of a misdemeanor. So big things to note here are that there needs to be a knowledge and intent to deceive the public. And I don't think that that's going to be a problem here, but I just wanted to point that out. And the other item is civil remedies that are available. If not criminal penalties, the civil remedies that are available are injunctions can be filed to prevent future violations from happening or to stop certain actions from happening, or to completely invalidate actions that were not in compliance with the Brown Act. And so those sorts of actions can be brought by the district attorney or frankly by any other interested party to try to invalidate something. So that's why it's a really big deal for us to make sure that we're always in compliance with the Brown Act. Next slide, please. My final words of advice here, or caution, however you want to look at it, are to remember that a majority of the members should not discuss local sales tax citizens oversight committee business items among themselves. So this means no serial meetings. If you're on social media, be cautious about what you post online. This committee will probably get discussed in online forums like Nextdoor, Facebook, or something like that. So be prepared for how you're going to handle those responses, if at all. Don't hit reply to all or forwarding on messages without considering whether or not this is going to potentially reach a majority of the members. And if you're ever in doubt about anything, then feel free to contact the city attorney's office. Next slide, please. That's all for my Brown Act presentation. So if anybody has any questions or concerns, you can always contact me at 916-774-5325. That's our main city attorney office line. And we have a lot of knowledgeable people in our office that are experts in the Brown Act. So if you don't get a hold of me, you can definitely get a hold of somebody else that can help you. And so if you ever have any questions about that, I can help. And I'd be happy to answer any questions now at this time.
Do we have any comments or questions from the committee? Okay, go ahead and type it in. Does anyone else have a question before we get Mr. Duffy's? Nope, okay. Just checking to see if anyone can hear me. I guess not. I hear you just fine.
Okay.
Okay. We are getting the message though. No comments? All right. I will now open item 6.2, the Brown Act, to public comment. Public comment may be given by telephone by calling 916-774-5353 when addressing the committee. Please state your name for the record and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Are there any public comments?
Chair Kitchell, we have no phone calls at this time, but the live stream is delayed approximately 30 seconds. So I will wait to see if we receive any phone calls. All right, it has been 30 seconds. We have no public comments on this item.
All right, I will close public comment and move on to our next item, which is 6.3, committee overview. And a question before you begin your presentation, Ms. Kaufman, is, are you open to questions during your presentation, or would you rather that we wait until the end?
I would prefer if you'd wait till the end, if that's all right. Thank you.
Over to you.
All right. Well, thank you. Good evening, Committee Chair Kitchell and committee members. My name is Dennis Kaufman, and I'm the city's Assistant City Manager and Chief Financial Officer, and I'll be presenting on the next 3 agenda items. First, I'll present an overview of the role of this committee. And in this overview, I'll cover the purpose of the committee, the current committee members and their terms, an overview of the Measure B local sales tax, and the specific duties of the committee as delineated by the City Council in the committee's charter. The purpose of the Local Sales Tax Oversight Committee is to provide an annual review and report to the City Council on the revenue and expenditures of the Measure B sales and use tax. The current committee members and terms are listed on this slide. The City Clerk's Office will begin recruitment for the June vacancies in the beginning of May. The Clerk's Office will reach out to the members whose terms end in June to verify that they would like to reapply. They will go through the process like a new candidate and will be listed on the ballot as an incumbent. Since you both filled unscheduled vacancies, you are able to serve 2 more terms after June of 2021 if you're interested. This first term was considered a partial term, so you can get 2 more full terms if reappointed. The Measure B half-cent local sales and use tax to protect Roseville's essential services was approved by voters in the November 6, 2018 election. On April 1st of 2019, the sales and use tax rate in Roseville increased from 7.25% to 7.75%, which is still one of the lowest rates in the region. And the initial estimates for Measure B to generate between $16 and $19 million of revenue each year. And as you'll hear later, the revenue in the first full fiscal year of the tax came in above the top end of this range. Measure B is a general sales and use tax. It's not dedicated to a specific purpose. Measure B is a general fund revenue source, and it's budgeted similar to property tax revenue and the regular Bradley-Burns sales tax. General fund expenditures are budgeted at the discretion of the City Council for any program or service. Expenditures made with general tax revenues are not tracked separately. In other words, property tax and sales tax revenues flow into the general fund to pay for services such as police and fire and parks, but we can't trace a particular general fund expenditure, like the staff at Fire Station 1, for example, back to a specific revenue source. They are funded by a combination of the general revenue sources in the general fund. And as you'll hear me more talk about later, the fiscal year 2019-2020 city budget was developed based on the City Council's Measure B priorities. So this slide shows the distribution of the sales and use tax rate amongst the different categories. Our city, Bradley-Burns sales tax rate is listed there in the middle at 1%. And in fiscal year 2019-20, the city received about $52 million in Bradley-Burns sales tax revenue. Measure B, which is the last one listed there, brought in about $19.7 million in local sales tax revenue. And that Measure B revenue all comes to the city of Roseville. And then you also notice there's a county/city public safety 0.5% as part of the sales tax rate. That sales tax is allocated to the counties, and then the counties distribute a small portion to each of the cities in that county to fund public safety. There are some key differences in how Measure B tax is applied compared to the Bradley-Burns tax. I just wanted to cover that briefly. Both the district tax, sales and use tax, it's imposed locally, but it's under the state sales and use tax law. It's generally applied to over-the-counter retail sales, like the regular Bradley-Burns sales tax, unless the retailer is a registered seller of vehicles, vessels, or aircraft, and I'll get into an example of that in a minute. The Measure B tax is also applied to out-of-state businesses that exceed $500,000 in total combined sales of tangible personal property in California, or for delivery in California in the preceding or current calendar year. And use tax is applied when someone buys physical merchandise without sales tax from a business that's located outside of the state. As it relates to the vehicle sales, I wanted to touch on this because it's a big differentiator in Roseville. The city collects Bradley-Burns sales tax from all of the auto sales at the Roseville Auto Mall, but only collects Measure B tax from Roseville residents who buy a vehicle at the auto mall. Conversely, if a Roseville resident buys a vehicle, let's say at the Folsom Auto Mall, Folsom would receive the Bradley-Burns 1% sales tax, Roseville would still collect the Measure B sales tax. So since Roseville is a sales tax importer because of the auto mall, that 1% Bradley Burns sales tax brings in more than double the amount of the 0.5% Measure B tax. Some people think that the 1% tax should bring in twice as much as the 0.5-cent tax, but because of the difference in how the taxes are applied primarily to vehicle sales, the Bradley Burns sales tax in Roseville brings in more than double the Measure B tax. And that's a frequent question that we receive. So back to the duties of the committee. The responsibilities of this committee include annually reviewing the revenue receipts and expenditures of the Measure B sales and use tax, annually review the status of programs and services funded wholly or partially with proceeds from Measure B, annually prepare and present an independent report to the City Council regarding Measure B revenues and expenditures, and it shall not be the purview of the committee to direct staff or to recommend any particular contracts, projects, services, or service levels. These matters remain solely under the authority of the City Council, City Manager, and professional staff. So with that overview of the committee's duties, that concludes this presentation. This is an information-only item, doesn't require any action by the committee, and we're available to answer any questions that you may have.
Do we have any comments or questions from the committee? I have a question on the last slide. Would you bring that up for a moment? The duties of the committee. And it's the first bullet item, annually review revenue receipts and expenditures of the Measure B sales and use tax. I'm not sure that I understand that. The revenues would be easy to trace, but how do we associate an expenditure with the Measure B sales and use tax?
And that is the conundrum that this committee and city staff are going to wrestle with year after year, because the ballot language provides for the committee to review the revenue and expenditures of the Measure B sales and use tax. But at the same time, the ballot measure says that Measure B sales tax revenue is a general fund general revenue, which means it doesn't get tracked specifically and separately from other general revenues of the general fund. And so we have to work together to interpret how to report back to the City Council your review of the revenue and then the expenditures in the general fund that include spending those new local sales tax revenues.
Okay.
Would it be safe to assume then that all monies spent by the city of Roseville include some Measure B money?
Well, as I explained, no, it's not easy to say that. But the way I explained it is really the best way I can explain it. We get so much in property tax revenue, we get so much in regular Bradley Burns sales tax revenue, and now we have the Measure B local sales tax revenue. They all come into the general fund as general revenue, and they fund all of the services that the council appropriates in the general fund to provide police and fire and parks and other department services. So you could look at it as every service we provide is funded by a mixture of all of those. That certainly is one way to look at it.
It is odd.
I think there might be some clarification later in your next presentation where you go into some details about what happened during this year.
Correct.
But it is an interesting question, and one that we have wrestled with in the past, and it might be worthwhile coming up with some criteria, some definitions of how we're going to do that. I know that the only year we have so far to go by is last year, but that was a unique year, and all of the funds were set aside.
Correct.
It would appear
the first year that we're going to actually be addressing expenditures.
It would appear to me then that if that there would be no reason that we couldn't look into any part of the expenditures if we thought we needed to, because there's a good percentage of the Measure B tax that's applied to all expenditures because it all goes into the same pot. I mean, what I'm saying is it wouldn't stop us from looking into just about anything.
Within the general fund, I agree with you.
Right. Right. However, there were some criteria that was established when the original committee, the advisory committee, recommended that the Measure B tax be put on the ballot. There were some specific discussions in that committee that we could reference to.
And if you're referring to the Engage Roseville initiative and the Community Priorities Advisory Committee, I do have a slide in my next presentation that tries to capture the outcomes of what their priorities were. And I agree with you. Having some criteria to measure, whether how the city is following those criteria, I think is part of your role.
Any other comments from the committee?
So would it be appropriate at the end of this meeting to try and figure out or speak about what we're going to use as measuring tools for the expenditures, or is this something that the city, the professionals kind of figure out for us and give us options to look at, or how are we going to start looking at that? Because I remember last year, all the money went to the rainy day fund, if you will, and we spoke about trying to figure out these measurements, and then COVID and everything happened. It kind of fell by the wayside. I assuming there's hopefully not going to be another pandemic this year. Can't promise anything. And so hopefully we can come up with a game plan to hopefully get those measurements, and not only measurements for this year, but something that solidifies the future too, that we can measure on an ongoing basis on a 2, 3, 4, 5 year plan, and hopefully have the committee not have to worry about this on a year-to-year basis.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my question is this something that we try and talk about today, or is it something that we meet or that we speak about at the next meeting and we come back with ideas? I don't know.
My thought is let me provide the next presentation. It might give you some ideas on what you are receiving and what you wish you were receiving. And because we talked about creating some kind of criteria scorecard, and I think that's the direction that we probably need to go to make this smoother in the future.
Okay.
Okay. Any other comments from the committee? All right, then we will open this to comments from the public. Public comment may be given by telephone by calling 916-774-5353. When addressing the committee, please state your name for the record and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Are there any public comments?
We have no phone calls at this time. The live stream is delayed approximately 30 seconds, so we'll wait to see if we receive any more phone calls. Okay, it's been 30 seconds. We have no public comments.
All right, I will close public comment, and we can move on to item 6.4, the year-end report. And Mr. Kaufman, you are up again.
Thank you. So this item is the year-end report for fiscal year 2019-2020. This agenda item provided hundreds of pages of documentation, but I promised to try to bring it all together into a succinct presentation as much as possible. We invited a few department heads to the meeting tonight to be available after my presentation to answer any questions you may have about their departments, including the acting police chief, Troy Bergstrom, the fire chief, Rick Barty, and the Director of the Parks, Recreation, and Libraries Department, Jill Geller. So to provide some context for fiscal year 2019-20, I'm going to take us back in time to spring of 2019 when this budget was developed. Some of you may recall that in August of 2019, I presented an overview of the fiscal year 2019-2020 budget to this committee, but I recognize not all of you were on the committee at the time, and it was a long time ago. The city's fiscal year runs from July 1st, and in this case, July 1st, 2019 to June 30th, 2020. The city budgeted a conservative estimate of $16 million in revenue from Measure B because it was the first full fiscal year of the new tax, and the estimate that the city had at the time that Measure B was placed on the ballot was a range of $16 to $19 million. I'll provide an overview of the budget that includes a financial outlook at the time, our budget development process, and Measure B strategic investments. So first, I wanted to mention that we included the city's budget as part of your agenda packet, and I wanted to identify here some of the pages in the budget document where Measure B specifically was referenced for you, or sales tax was referenced, so that if you want to go back and find those pages in the budget document, you can. I wanted to try to make it as easy for you as I could. This next slide is a graph that we created in spring of 2019 when the budget was developed, and we included it in our budget and brief document that was distributed to the public. It shows the plan to build the stabilization reserve that the City Council approved, and I'll talk more about that stabilization reserve a little later. This graph shows that we build that stabilization reserve in the first few years of Measure B, with that goal of that reserve being to preserve essential services during future economic downturns. Little did we know that we would have an economic downturn so soon. The graph also depicts the fact that expenses are expected to once again outpace revenue growth at some point in the future. Of course, this forecast was developed before the pandemic and its economic impacts. Whenever we do these 5-year forecasts, we do include known factors, including known salary and benefit increases. We also estimate for the general fund about 4 new positions each year in the general fund to accommodate new growth that's happening in the city. And so when you look at that expense line, it does include some estimates of growth. This next slide is a depiction of our annual budget cycle. And as you can see, it is a year-round process. And at the top, you can see January and February and March. We've already started planning for the fiscal year 2021-2022 budget. I'll return to this slide at the end of my presentation to talk about how this committee's report fits in to our annual city budget cycle. But I just wanted to remind you that, we were closing out last year by presenting this report to the committee, and we're already starting to plan fiscal year 21-22. So we're always talking about 3 different fiscal years at the same time, which makes things a little confusing. These next 4 slides introduce criteria that we use to develop the budget for fiscal year 2019-20. This slide provides the list of council priorities that were in effect in spring of 2019 for developing that budget. Subsequent to developing this budget, the City Council held a strategic planning workshop in fall of 2019, and they updated their goals. They identified some strategies to achieve some of their new goals in their strategic plan. You'll hear more about those goals and strategies next year when we review the fiscal year 2020-2021 year-end report. But this is the list of council priorities that went into developing the budget for the year we're talking about. This slide summarizes the city's focus on fiscal responsibility, and I won't read through the whole thing, but as we develop each fiscal year's budget, we're focused on balancing the general fund budget, matching our revenues and expenses, identifying any operational efficiencies as we're developing the budget. We're looking at vacant positions within the city and looking for ways to redeploy resources. We're always looking to pay down our unfunded liabilities, particularly related to pensions and retiree health benefits. And that last bullet there is key. We're funding the General Fund Economic Stabilization Reserve that the council adopted to maintain city services during the next recession. This slide summarizes many of the actions that the city took prior to Measure B going to the voters, and we continue to take to live within our means. And a few highlights here is partnering with the labor groups. The city partnered with the unions to reduce our long-term pension costs and other retiree health benefits. The city, through the Great Recession and ever since, has reduced full-time general fund staffing. Our compensation philosophy in the city is to maintain a position of being median in the market. And so we do comparisons with other comparable agencies within our region and aim to be in the middle, in the median with compensation. The city had performed audits of all of its departments before Measure B to make sure the city was acting as efficient as possible. And I'll just highlight that last one. The city has a very active state and federal legislative advocacy program to protect our interests, because both the state legislature and Congress are always thinking of new legislation that has impacts on the city of Roseville. So then this is the final slide that I mentioned, that this is the feedback from Engage Roseville, which included the outcomes from the Community Priorities Advisory Committee that you mentioned earlier, Chair Kitchell. And this, all of this feedback were themes that were considered as we were building this first budget with a full year of Measure B revenue, from prioritizing efficient public safety to that last bullet, of recruiting, training, and deploying volunteers. The second to last bullet is pursuing the fund stabilization and revenue enhancement strategies. That ties to both establishing and building up that stabilization reserve, as well as identifying and pursuing new general fund revenues to maintain that balanced budget in the general fund in the long term. So with those themes in mind for developing the budget, I have a couple slides summarizing the general fund budget for fiscal year 2019-2020. This pie graph shows the revenues in the general fund. Very big picture. This graph shows the primary revenue sources. You see that blue pie slice is sales tax. That includes both the Bradley-Burns sales tax as well as the Measure B sales tax. In the future, I'll break those out into two different slices so you see them in two different colors. Property tax is the next largest general fund revenue source, followed by a variety of other smaller categories of general fund revenue, totaling about $160 million. On the expenditure side of the ledger, this graph shows the general fund budget broken out primarily between our departments, police and fire on the right-hand side, which make up about half of the general fund budget, parks being the next largest slice of the pie, which is why I invited those three department heads to join us tonight in case you have questions. And the expenditures here total about $158 million. So I have a few slides that discuss how we approach developing this budget for fiscal year 2019-20 with Measure B in mind. And one of the challenges that we addressed going into developing this budget was knowing that if Measure B hadn't passed, we were looking at a $6 to $9 million budget deficit in the general fund. We would have been looking at making service reductions. But because Measure B passed, we did not have to make those reductions. So we still went through an exercise and asked our departments, what types of services would you have proposed to reduce or eliminate had Measure B not passed? Because those services were maintained by Measure B. We didn't have to make those reductions because the voters approved Measure B. And you can see here, I have a couple slides here of significant amounts of Measure B was used to invest in some of these services to avoid making service reductions. Within police and fire, some of their specialized units, within the fire department, we would have potentially been looking at browning out a fire engine company. Within the Parks and Rec and Libraries Department, we would have been looking at reducing or eliminating a lot of programs and potentially closing pools. On this next slide, we have some of the different services that our Public Works Department identified that probably would have been reduced or eliminated. And there's a bullet there for economic development as well. So those are some of the services we identified that Measure B allowed us to maintain instead of reduce or eliminate in this budget. And then there were services that were restored, things that had been reduced or eliminated in past years because of budget constraints. And these were some of the things that were added back into the budget. And I remember last year when I went through this list, there were a couple of you who requested that we try to identify the dollar amounts associated with these. And so I went back and found the dollar amounts that we added into the budget for each of these line items. And a couple of the major ones here on this slide is the library hours and materials. For those of you that remember, our library hours had been significantly reduced until Measure B passed. Bringing back 4th of July fireworks was an important aspect for the community. The goats grazing in the open space, very popular service in Roseville, and we restored funding for that program out of the general fund, as well as returning some of our park maintenance standards and pruning trees and cleaning up unsheltered camps, primarily in our open space areas. And we added some new services. We have a new police beat that was created and partially staffed out in the west side of Roseville with 4 new police officers in fiscal year 2019-20, as well as adding 1 police traffic officer. And then in the case of our citywide parks, both Crab and Central Park had not been fully developed, and part of the commitment with Measure B to the community was to complete those citywide parks. And those citywide parks had been put on hold because the city general fund did not have the resources to pay for maintenance of completing those parks. But with the Measure B revenue, the plan is to fully fund maintenance of those parks with general fund resources now. And with this fiscal year budget, we actually did not add money to do the maintenance because the parks had not been completed yet. But the park construction started this fiscal year. And I included in your agenda packet a couple recent council communications identifying that those 2 parks have been completed. And those documents provide a little detail about what the amenities are in those completed citywide parks. But I wanted to share that with you. And then finally, consistent with that Engage Roseville feedback, the City Council adopted that Stabilization Reserve policy, which I also included in your agenda packet for your information, to increase general fund reserves in order to maintain services. And with the fiscal year 2019-20 budget, we invested about $6.8 million in that fund, as well as making a transfer to our emergency reserve fund, which by policy is 10% of our general fund expenditures. Just to summarize, as we talked about our fiscal year 2019-20 budget before COVID, we talked about cautious optimism, that this budget was allowing us to maintain fiscal responsibility. It aligned with the council priorities. It aligned with the Engage Roseville feedback. We were living within our means. We also knew, though, that those lines between revenue growth and expense growth are going to cross again in the future. And so the city does continue to look for new revenue sources. And we also always face limited capital available for new projects or even replacement and rehabilitation of some of our current assets and amenities in the community. But this budget reflected the Measure B priorities, maintained our current service levels, focused on some high priority new services, and we built up that stabilization reserve. Fast forward to March of 2020, and we all learned the acronym for the coronavirus disease 2019 as the financial markets were jolted and recession began. The city put in place a hiring freeze to slow spending, pause non-essential spending. Critical positions that departments need to fill are reviewed by a committee before being approved to fill. When the city was developing the budget for the current fiscal year 2020-2021, last spring, departments requested augmentations totaling about $3.5 million that were deferred into the future because of the unprecedented fiscal uncertainty because of the pandemic. As the pandemic played out and really continues to affect the economy, staff have continued to provide regular updates, financial updates to the City Council and the community about the city's financial condition. The most recent budget update to Council was last month when we presented the year-end financial report to City Council, and that's what we're here to discuss tonight, and those documents are also included in your agenda packet. So, included in your agenda packet is the city's comprehensive annual financial report, or CAFR. I identified here a few of the pages in the document where you can see references to Measure B or the city's sales tax revenue. I also included in your agenda packet that fourth quarter year-end budget report that we presented to City Council last month, as well as the council communication that went along with that report. And the summary of those reports basically show that the final general fund budgetary results for last fiscal year generated a $7.7 million one-time increase in fund balance or a one-time surplus that came from $3.2 million of revenue in excess of budget, expenditures that came in less than budget by $4.9 million, and non-operating activity that fell short of estimates by about $400,000. People ask me, what is non-operating activity? Those are our categories of spending related to debt service and loans and capital projects. And I have some more detail on the next couple slides. So this slide shows the revenue results for the general fund, at least the primary revenue sources making up that $3.2 million positive results. The Bradley Burns sales tax, which is the largest general fund revenue, you see at the top, ended the year $2.4 million below budget due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Measure B sales tax, also affected by the pandemic, ended the year approximately $3.7 million above budget, and that's because we conservatively budgeted that revenue in the first fiscal year. We knew the range that was estimated was 16 to 19 million, but because the tax was new, we wanted to make sure we budgeted with fiscal constraint. So we budgeted $16 million. It ended up coming in at 19.7, and so that's why we have a $3.7 million positive variance. Property tax revenue exceeded budget estimates by $2.7 million due to rising property values, combined with the level of property sales activity that's going on and new development in Roseville. The pandemic significantly impacted our parks, recreation, and libraries, their programs, and the revenues associated with those programs. Fortunately, in the general fund, that department had, for the most part, offsetting expenditure savings in the general fund. And other notable revenue results included our hotel tax, our transient occupancy tax, or TOT, which ended below budget due to the pandemic, and building permit and engineering inspection fees that exceeded budget estimates. The development side of the city's budget is still going strong. The developers are still building houses out in the west side of Roseville. This table shows the same revenue variances with their respective percentages. Compared to budget, Bradley Burns was 4% below budget, while property tax revenue was 5% above the budget estimate. And overall, general fund operating revenue finished the year 2% above budget. For the Measure B revenue of 19.7, staff provided in your agenda packet a document called General Ledger Detail, which provides a summary and detail down to the transaction level from the city's financial system, as well as documentation from the State of California Department of Tax and Fee Administration. They're the ones who collect and distribute sales tax revenue. And I provide you with some documentation showing what their remittances look like for our sales tax revenue. On the expenditure side, this table shows how we ended the year with $4.9 million of expenditures below budget. The primary contributing factors were savings from vacant positions, some of which we held vacant because of our hiring controls. Some departments also experienced savings because they paused or canceled some programs or activities or projects due to the pandemic. And overall, general fund operating expenditures finished the year about 3% below budget. So with that $7.7 million in general fund budgetary results, Council approved a budget adjustment to appropriate $400,000 to fund a contract obligation to relocate overhead electric lines on a parcel of land that was exchanged by the city. This land exchange was initiated by the city because an environmental review and preliminary design work for a Longfield sports complex out in West Roseville identified issues with a city parcel that had been planned for that site. Relocating the overhead electric lines was part of the land exchange agreement, and there were no other alternate funding sources identified to fund that cost. And that site will ultimately provide a citywide park with sporting fields. The budget adjustment also transferred approximately $70,000 to the Youth Development Fund to provide a subsidy, really a down payment to address the year-end deficit created by the pandemic's impacts on our city's adventure club operations. Our adventure club programs were closed for a number of months because of COVID-19. They're reopened now, but as you can imagine, they're very, very limited in the services they can provide because of social distancing and the PPE and the cleaning and sanitation protocols that have to be put in place. And so that program is really running at a deficit. And for last fiscal year, the general fund provided a $70,000 subsidy to keep that fund in the black, so to speak. And we'll be looking later this spring at the current fiscal year and its financial condition, and we'll have more information for City Council about that in a couple months. And then finally, the rest of that $7.7 million one-time year-end surplus, we recommended transferring to that General Fund Stabilization Reserve. This transfer brings the reserve balance up to almost the full 15% included in the reserve policy. It gets us to about 14.6%, just shy of that goal. And so let's see. So that's what we recommend, and that's what Council approved for the year-end surplus. Before I end the presentation about this year-end report, though, for last fiscal year, I also want to provide you a little bit of context about the current fiscal year, and before we open it up for questions, because your report to Council is going to come in while they're developing the budget for next fiscal year 2021-2022. And I think it's important for you to have a little bit of information about the current fiscal year. When we adopted this budget, COVID had started, and so we knew that we had limited resources. There was a lot of uncertainty about the economy and our revenues, and so we adopted basically a status quo expenditure budget. We had to build in things that we knew were increases, like our CalPERS pension costs, and where some of our service and supply costs were increasing because of contracts that the city was in. Like I said, we deferred about $3.5 million of augmentation requests that departments had submitted during budget development. We only included in the current year budget critical augmentations, including a school resource officer for our new high school and a police dispatcher, because the service demands on our dispatch center were overwhelming the staff levels that we had. Like I said, most department budget augmentation requests were deferred to the future. And the interesting thing about this is we had estimated our major general fund tax revenues before the pandemic, and then we had to reevaluate them before we proposed the budget. And so I have a couple slides here. This first slide shows a table of what those pre-pandemic estimates were for our general fund major revenues, and then what the reduced estimates are. That current estimate column is what we built into the current year budget. And you can see that was a reduction of about $14 million in the general fund budget, down to $126 million of revenue. And on the next slide, you'll see that $126 million at the top, plus other departmental revenues and transfers, brings the budget to $158.7. And then we have expenditures of 160, and we were projecting a shortfall of $2 million in the current year budget. And so our adopted budget calls for a transfer from the Stabilization Reserve in order to balance the budget if needed. And we've asked the council to wait for us to make that transfer, because we are hopeful that our revenues will come in above the amounts that we estimated in the budget, but because there's so much uncertainty, we just don't know. And we're halfway through the fiscal year, And things are looking a little bit better than we expected. So we have not made that transfer from the Stabilization Reserve, and I hope that we will not need to. But one of the key messages I continue to share with the council and with staff is that when we developed this current year budget with that $2 million shortfall, we estimated Measure B revenue of $18.5 million to balance that budget. If Measure B had not passed, we would have had a $20.5 million shortfall in the current year budget. We would not have been able to build up that stabilization reserve over the last couple of years. And as a result, we would have been facing significant reductions both last year when the pandemic started and this year in the budget for the current fiscal year. And so I think that that's an important point for us to keep in mind. I mentioned those reserves a couple times, and like I said, I included the council adopted policy in your staff report agenda packet, but the reserve policy is basically 15% of general fund revenue for the stabilization reserve and 10% for the emergency reserve. And really the difference there is the stabilization reserve is intended to address revenue shortfalls caused by an economic downturn, and the emergency reserve is for really any other unanticipated non-recurring expenditures that come up during an emergency. So there continues to be significant uncertainty about the impact of the pandemic on the economy and on our tax revenues. Leading economists are estimating that the recovery could take 2 or more years based on the assumption that the vaccines that are being rolled out will bring the pandemic to an end later this year. I've listed here some updated results on our sales tax. We have an updated forecast that we received a few minutes ago that does show an improvement in our local economy and a recovery that looks like about a 2-year period, which shows us at the moment, right, we still have 6 months left in the fiscal year, but at the moment, our consultants are working with us to project that our sales tax revenues are estimated to come in above our budgeted amounts by a few $1 million, including with Measure B there, $19.3 million is our current forecast compared to that budget amount of $18.5 million. And as was mentioned earlier, although brick and mortar establishments, a lot of them have had reduced sales because of business closures or restrictions, some of that sales tax revenue has been partially offset by increased internet sales. And we have seen a lot more sales tax revenue from internet sales. But the good news is that COVID-19 has not affected sales tax revenues to the extent that we initially projected. And you've probably read that in the news, even at the state level. The state budget also forecasted pretty deep declines in sales tax revenue. And it hasn't been as bad as it could have been. But there still is a lot of uncertainty out there about the future of the economy. On the property tax side, our updated information from the county property tax assessor shows that we will likely end this fiscal year with a little bit of a surplus of revenue in excess of budget. And on our hotel tax, or TOT, we're tracking pretty close to the budget through December. Our hotels in Roseville have done okay, fairly well. The occupancy is trending higher than we had estimated a little bit, which is good. You know, we don't have a large convention center here that draws a lot of conventions, and during a pandemic, apparently that's a good thing. Our hotels are actually doing okay, but we reduced our revenue estimates for TOT quite significantly, and the good news is we should meet or beat those revenue estimates. So this is an information-only item. No action is necessary. I think it's important for you to have that context about how the budget was developed for fiscal year 2019-20 as you consider the year-end report, as well as what's happened in the current year from budget development to where we are currently. And I hope this information, along with the materials, the hundreds of pages of materials in your packet, provides you with the information that you need for your report to the City Council. This concludes my presentation. I'm available to answer your questions as well as the other 3 department heads that I mentioned. And I will open it up back to the chair.
All right, thank you. Thanks for that presentation. Do we have any comments or questions from our members?
I have a couple questions. Dennis, thank you for that presentation. That was amazing. A lot of information. I had a quick question about the fiscal year 1920 with the augmentation request of $3.5 million. When they deferred that money, do they defer that to the 2021 budget year, even though there is an end result of a surplus of $7.7 million? Or what happened with that money? And so there's twofold. Then if that got moved to the 2021, does that account for part of the $2 million loss?
So thank you. Great question. First of all, that $3.5 million of augmentations was a citywide number, not just general fund. Some of those augmentations related to our electric and our environmental utilities. And so what we asked council to do was to defer those items until October of 2020. Because they adopted the budget in June. And at that time, we were hoping the pandemic would be over in a few months. I don't know if you all remember that, right?
Yeah.
And so we said, we'll come back to council in June with a financial update, and we'll bring back those deferred items. And so we did. We came back to council in October. We gave them a financial update. And for the majority of the utility-related items that had been deferred, we recommended that those be moved forward and included in their budget. A few of them were positions, a few of them were some vehicles that solid waste needed to meet some regulatory requirements, for example. But in the case of the general fund augmentation requests, because we still have so much uncertainty at that time about our sales tax revenue primarily, we said that we would continue to defer them. And at this point, here we are in February now, we're starting to develop the budget for next fiscal year. And I've told the departments, if you still want to request those items that were deferred, request them again as part of next year's budget. Because some of those things may not be a priority anymore for those departments since almost a year has gone by. Their needs may have changed. And so that's where we are with them. We did say to council and to staff, if any of those augmentation requests is critical, is legally required to meet a mandate, bring it forward and we'll consider that, and we'll recommend it to council as a separate one-off item. But there haven't been very many of those. For the most part, those things that were deferred last year are still deferred, and we're going to ask departments to bring them back and request them again as part of next year's budget.
Of the 21-22?
Correct.
Okay. And then one question about the Measure B. Do you collect, and I remember I asked this before, did you say you collect it on a monthly basis? I can't remember exactly the answer. I'm sorry.
No, it's a great question, and it's funny because I almost included a slide, because when we got into this pandemic and the economic downturn, one of the things we did was provide a lot of detail to the city council about the timing of when we get the sales tax revenue, because it also provides us information when we get that money. And so we do get a monthly wire from the state for our sales tax revenue, but the timing of it is basically they give it to us quarterly. Let me say it this way. They calculate it quarterly, even though they give us a monthly payment. Okay. So we get three monthly payments each quarter, right? The first two are estimates, and the third one is a true-up payment.
Okay.
And they come a couple months after the associated economic activity happens. Does that make sense? So yeah, perfect.
Mm-hmm. And so my next question is, how much variance have we seen with the Measure B as a whole on a month-to-month basis since the pandemic started to now? Is it pretty steady flow? Did you see a huge downtrend? Because only reason I say that is I know our house, kind of changed our spending to internet more so than maybe going outside the city limits to purchase things. So I didn't know if that would increase or how much that fluctuates.
What's interesting is because each quarter, those first two monthly payments are estimates made by the state, that makes comparing from month to month to month to month very difficult.
Sure.
On top of that, right, Measure B is a new tax revenue, so the state probably has to learn how to estimate those payments. And on top of that, because of COVID, the state put in different opportunities for businesses to file their sales tax returns late, pay their sales tax payments late, and gave them opportunities for basically a zero interest payment plan to pay their sales tax over 12 months if they were a small enough business. So there was so much uncertainty about how many businesses are going to take advantage of these programs that when we would get a check, we wouldn't really know how well that reflected the economic activity of the month 2 months ago, which is part of the uncertainty.
It's really interesting because this is kind of the same boat we were in last year. We didn't really know how Measure B was going to work out, and we still don't because of unforeseen circumstances. So, okay, I thank you for answering my questions.
Yeah. Thank you.
Dennis, there were a couple of mentions of West Roseville. We're talking about 4 additional police officers being hired for that area and some growth there, stuff like that. We're talking about West Roseville. What are we talking about here? You know, Blue Oaks, Quail Glen, Wood Creek, Sun City. Is that kind of West Roseville? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, for that new police beat, I think I would like to phone a friend and ask the acting police chief to chime in because I don't know the geographic area that beat is covering.
Just in general, yeah.
Well, I will be your friend, Dennis, and answer that question for you.
Thank
you. Beat 7 was established last year after Measure B funding came in. It was actually a revamping of all of our police beats because we couldn't just redraw one line and create a new beat without it affecting the other beats. So we actually have multiple beats in West Roseville. Beats 5 and 6 are considered on the west side of the city, which is pretty much everything on the other side of Foothills. What the Measure B money allowed us to do was to open a new Beat 7. Beat 7 is everything west of Fitiment Road, but it also includes the Sun City neighborhood. So Sun City is the only neighborhood that's east of Fitiment, and then it's all of the new development west of Fitiment that falls into our new Beat 7. It also allowed us to redraw Beat 6 and Beat 5 and make them a little bit smaller that cover the other parts of the west side because if you look at our beat map in comparison to the east side beats, the west side ones were very large, and so it let us even some things out. But 7 itself that came from Measure B is more or less everything west of Fitiment.
That's great. That's very specific and helpful. I appreciate it. I grew up in Roseville, went to Oakmont High School in 1967, and those were fields out there, and now it's fastest growing part of our city.
I actually have some questions. So first of all, every CFO's dream to be over in excess of budget on revenues and under budget on expenses in a pandemic. So kudos to you for managing it well because that's not an easy task. So good job.
Thank you.
So a couple of questions. You had show the newly forecasted numbers for year to date, and thankfully it showed revenue again. It looks like it's trending ahead of the original revised budget for COVID. And so if I calculate right, it's about $4.4 million in excess of revenue, which seems like it's going to overcome your $2 million forecasted deficit. What about expenses? Are expenses trending above or below your forecast?
Well, we just went through a round of what we call budget monitoring meetings with each of the general fund departments. And I would say overall, we're probably trending right around budget for where we are halfway through the fiscal year. We are still monitoring all of the requests to fill positions through our hiring control process. We literally have a committee of executives that meet twice a week to review requests to fill positions. So my expectation is that most departments will come in under budget. But at this point, overall, I think we're pretty close on the expenditure side. I don't think we'll see 4.9 million again, but we'll see. 6 months left to go.
And then I imagine there's probably a large shift to online purchases. So I'm not sure if that's a challenge to ensure that we collect all of the sales tax and use tax that's due to the city of Roseville. Is that something that the city pursues or has a firm to help pursue those funds?
We do. We have a consulting firm that helps us pursue those funds. There was a Supreme Court case called Wayfair that was decided now about 2 years ago that resulted in the online marketplaces like Amazon or Wayfair to collect sales tax from online transactions on their platform. So not just Amazon sales, but if small businesses are doing business on Amazon and selling to consumers in Roseville, they're required to collect sales tax, even if they don't have a physical presence in California. And according to our sales tax consultants, when we met with them recently, we have seen a little over $1 million in Bradley Burns sales tax related to those online sales that we weren't getting before. And part of their contract is for them to identify any sales tax revenue that's not appropriately getting allocated to the city.
Okay, thank you. And then let's see, it was just, I think I probably know the answer just based on your comments, but on the budget to actual variance on this, the Bradley Burns versus the Measure B. So Bradley Burns, it came in, pretty significantly under the original projection, and then the Measure B came in excess. And so in general, you would think it would have the same sales tax base and it would trend in the same variance. But you did mention that because of the auto sales, it's not quite the same sales tax base, and I'm not sure if it just has to do with the conservatism that was used to project Measure B.
Yes, it's really the combination of those two things. Because it was the first fiscal year, we didn't know what to expect. We conservatively budgeted the low end of that range that we had, $16 million. If we had budgeted the high end of that range, $19 million, then we would have had a positive variance of $700,000 for that revenue source. Fortunately, we try to be fiscally conservative in Roseville, and we budgeted the low end of the range, and we got lucky because COVID really affected our sales tax and our hotel tax revenue. Fortunately, we had conservatively budgeted that Measure B revenue. But yeah, as I explained with auto sales, and there are some smaller variances in how the taxes are applied, but the auto sales is the biggest one for Roseville because of the auto mall. We'll always see a little bit different behavior in the sales tax results. And even in looking at like the top 25 or top 50 sales tax generators, the top 50 businesses in Roseville that generate sales tax, the list looks very different between the Bradley Burns sales tax and the Measure B sales tax because of those auto dealers in the auto mall.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Okay. So I wanted to look at one of the slides. You had presented some slides that to me would be useful in terms of our report and what our responsibilities are. And those slides talked about services that we prevented, removing services that we were able to restore, and new services, the Beat 7 and so forth. So, but my question is, it seems as if those are budgeted amounts and not actuals. And the reason I say is I think like the 4th of July fireworks, that didn't happen this year, right? So is it possible to get actuals for that information?
It would. I have to think about that. Some of them would be easier than others. Because you're right. Some of them may not, like the 4th of July fireworks. But some of them, for example, where we added $300,000 to park maintenance. If we currently had a budget of $1 million for park maintenance and we added $300,000, I'm not sure how we will identify the actual amount associated with that. You know what I mean? They're not necessarily discrete things.
Like, for example, one of them was the stabilization. I think it looks like in the budget it was to add $6.8 million to the Stabilization Reserve Fund, another almost $700,000 to the Emergency Reserve Fund. It seems like maybe actuals were about $7.2 million or $7.3 million compared to this $7.5.
Actually, for those two line items, the actual amounts were, we made those budgeted transfers.
Oh, okay. So this $6.8 million into the Economic Stabilization Fund, that is in addition to the $7.2 million?
That is correct.
Okay, that makes a big difference. I understand.
Yes.
So in total, the stabilization fund received $14 million this year.
Correct.
And then there was an additional $700,000 into the emergency fund.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, that helps to answer my questions. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Okay, I'm gonna tag along with a couple of the questions that Megan had. One is, would it be possible to show the general fund expenditures in a slightly different way? And that would be to compare the actuals for 18-19, the actuals for 19-20, and then the budget for 2021, broken down as salaries and benefits, materials and supplies, vehicles and equipment, and capital projects in those categories.
Actuals for fiscal year 19, actuals for fiscal year 20, and budget for fiscal year 21?
2021, yes.
Okay. So I will share with you, the city implemented a new financial system about 1.5 years ago. We're still developing reports. Developing reports is always an adventure, but we do have a report that is similar to what I think you're asking for. So I will check with our staff tomorrow and see if we can pull that together. I believe we can.
And I think that would help us get a sense for, the expenditures as far as changes over the period of time that we're talking about, that Measure B has been in effect, and in line with sort of, since we can't tie the revenues to actual expenditures, we could at least have a sense for how expenditures are changing in relation to the revenues that are coming in and the categories. In other words, I know you have a committee to hire people now, which is a different approach than it used to be. So you're probably trying to control those new hires to some extent, right, and pay raises and those kinds of things. But if we were to see categories like that, then we could perhaps mention in the report that those things are being controlled.
Okay, I will see what we can put together for you.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, and then this is sort of just a quick question for the police chief. On one of the slides, you mentioned training for the police officers, and my question is there new training in effect to help train the officers to de-escalate situations? Is that an objective that is part of your procedures at this point?
So I won't say it's new. De-escalation training for us is something that's been going on for years.
Okay.
It's shifted over the years as we learned new ways and came up with new processes. But de-escalation has been a part of how we train in use of force, how we train in firearms, defensive tactics. It's been a part of that for a long time. So I wouldn't say anything new, but yes, it has continued.
Okay. All right, that's all I had. Any other comments from the committee or questions? All right, then we will open it up to public comment. Public comment may be made, may be given by telephone by calling 916-774-5353 when addressing the committee. Please state your name for the record and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Are there any public comments?
All right, Chair Kitchell, we have no phone calls at this time. The live stream is delayed about 30 seconds, so we'll wait to see if we receive any phone calls. right, it's been about 30 seconds. We have no public comments.
All right, I will close public comment on item 6.4. Our next item is 6.5, the report to council. Staff, oh, go ahead. Do you want to just go ahead and take it?
Sure. So this final item on our agenda is to determine which two committee members will draft the report to the city council. And so the staff recommendation is for the committee to approve a motion to designate one or two committee members to prepare the committee's report to the city council. On the next slide, this is where I repeated that annual budget cycle graph. As you may recall, the report last year from the committee to the city council took the form of a memo. And I included that memo from last year in your agenda packet for your reference. And the memo was issued by the committee and presented to the city council last year in March. We have scheduled for the committee to present its report to the city council this year on March 17th. Staff recommends that you select one or two committee members to draft the memo or report. And after the draft is submitted to city staff, we will distribute the draft in advance of the next committee meeting, which is on February 24th. At that meeting, the committee can approve the draft as is or approve friendly amendments, which staff can help facilitate in advance of presenting the memo or report to the city council on March 17th. And so again, the staff recommendation is to approve a motion to select one or two committee members to draft the report or memo. And staff are available to answer any questions you might have about this process.
All right, at this time, I will ask the committee if there are any comments or questions. And we will now open it up to public comment. Public comment may be given by telephone by calling 916-774-5353. When addressing the committee, please state your name for the record and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Are there any public comments?
Chair Kitchell, we have no phone calls at this time. The live stream is delayed approximately 30 seconds, so I will wait to see if we receive any phone calls. Okay, it's been 30 seconds and we have no public comments.
Public comment is closed. Do I have a nomination for a committee member or two, preferably two, I suspect, to prepare the committee's report to the city council? And I think last year, I believe, Megan, you and Rick were the ones who prepared the report. Is that
Correct.
Yes. I have a caveat on myself. I am taking care of a family health issue and traveling to Southern California for 2 weeks out of the month, each month. So I am a little pressed for time myself. Otherwise, I would volunteer to help.
I'm happy to volunteer. This is Patrick.
Thank you. Anyone else? Megan, are you willing to take it on again?
Sure. If the committee member Knight doesn't have any interest, then I'd be happy to take it on again, or committee member Duffy.
Okay. Do I have a motion to appoint committee members Comstock and Krafka as the designees to prepare the committee's report to City Council?
I'll make that motion.
Second.
All right. Thank you. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Thank you, members Comstock and Krafka.
If I may, Megan and Patrick, if when it comes time to start doing this and putting it together, if you're going to do this with a GoToMeeting, Zoom meeting, or whatever, I would love to be a part of that. Mainly not to do, but to see. I would like to learn sort of what it's taken to put this together and the form that it takes. Like to peer over your shoulder, if I may, when you get to doing that. I promise not to interfere.
I got this, Joe. The Brown Act. Chris.
Ah, come on.
You got to let Joe speak.
Yeah.
We would love to have you work with us, but I don't think we can.
Brings a tear to my eye to hear this. Good job.
Aww.
I was listening.
I tell you what, Commissioner Kite, you can talk to us all you want about this report. How about that? Yeah, to the staff people. Yeah, but that's why we're trying to keep it to just one or two to prevent it from being a majority of the members meeting without it being a properly noticed meeting. So thanks for catching all that. Yeah.
I would be happy afterwards, because this is new to me too, Chris, to talk with you of how we came about it or the process that we did. I'm happy to speak with you about that, the process of it, and things along those lines. But I don't know what the process is right now, so that's
right.
Well, so that'll be part of it. So there's no process that's really defined. We kind of stumbled through it last year, and frankly, last year was easy, right? Because last year it all went to the stabilization fund. So it really we'll come up with something.
We'll figure it out.
Yep.
Yeah, my reason for that is just in case in future for another year that someone needs to step up and do that. I would love to be willing to do it, but feeling empowered a bit by having some knowledge on how the past process went. But that's fine. Plenty of time for that as the year goes on.
I would think it would be a great recommendation for every year, if one who's done it in a former year, and then a new person does it. That way you don't have to start from scratch, and you can have some legacy, and yet a new person can do it to kind of spread the love.
Boy, does that make sense.
I think that's a great idea.
I think I do have some difficulty with the process and the Brown Act, and because the rest of us on the committee who are not actually helping to prepare it don't have much opportunity to review it and ask questions. I don't know how we can accomplish that and still abide by the Brown Act. It was a little bit of a conundrum last year, and this year I think it's going to be even bigger because there is more complication to it this year than there was last year.
I thought, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought there was the draft was created with the two, and then we had a meeting where that draft was essentially presented to the committee to comment on, and that was kind of my idea, or how we would go about if we only had one or two preparing the report, but still get the whole comments from the entire commission, where we bring that draft report to this committee. It's an agenda item where we discuss it. Is that what we did last year? Forgive me if I don't remember the.
Yes.
Okay.
It was, but it was very simple because there wasn't. I mean, it was one transaction.
Okay.
Right.
So it was very simple.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm just wondering if, well, I guess we'll see how it goes, but I'm a little concerned about only having one opportunity to provide feedback.
Sure.
That, depending on the complexity of the report, but it would be nice to be able to have an exchange of ideas after the draft. Sometimes a complicated draft can be reworked 3 or 4 times.
Right.
I just don't know how it's going to look. None of us know.
I think we'll have to just have, some good, healthy discussions during the next meeting, and we'll just have to take good notes on changes.
Yeah.
All right. It sounds like a plan.
Is that deadline for the city council, is that a hard deadline where if we wanted to meet again as the committee, we could do it again if we don't get everything ironed out in the next meeting?
We are sharing that date with the council. Whether we could push it to the next council meeting, possibly.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's possible, but I am presenting to the council tomorrow night the schedule, and it has that date on it. So
Okay.
It would be wise if we stick to
So
the date.
that date.
Really the reason is so that they get the information early enough to provide input into developing next year's budget.
So does staff recommend a memo format this year as well? Or are there any other recommendations that you think might work better for this year?
I thought the memo turned out really well last year. I thought it was a great summary, and it was truthfully more thorough than I expected. And so my feeling is, augmenting that a little bit as you see fit,
Okay.
I think would be appropriate. I don't think you need to go and create, something more report-like, unless as a group that you feel like you should.
Well, Dennis, I seem to recall that at one point we talked about staff developing a scorecard.
Yes.
Have you had a chance to take a look at that?
I have taken a look at the idea. We've talked about it, and unfortunately, it was one of the many activities that got paused because of COVID and everything else going on. It is still something I think we should do, and I'd like for us to talk about it at that next committee meeting to see if you all agree that that would make it easier in future years, because I think it would.
Mm-hmm.
So, since we don't have those scorecards, and we have to have it presented by March, we're thinking more of a vague type, like you said, memo, and then try and plan more for the next coming years.
I mean, for this report, I think it's whatever you feel you need to make out of it.
Okay.
So do you mind if I talk timeline? So our next meeting is the 24th, and so you'll need the memo and plenty of time to post it and share, right? So what date would the final draft be due to you, Dennis and Terry?
Believe we have to publish the agenda 72 hours before the meeting, correct?
Yep.
Joe? So
Yep.
we're probably talking by Friday the 19th.
Okay.
So it's a couple weeks.
Okay.
Well, thank you again, you two, for taking this on.
Yeah, I
No
want
problem.
to say also that I think that the memo format from last year was very well received also. So, even if we start from that as a starting point for moving forward, and I know there's things that we've talked about trying to readjust for future years, or, as we go on with this oversight committee, some improvements and efficiencies that we can do. So we're definitely receptive to those types of things as we work on this next memo.
There's also no Brown Act violation in you reaching out to city staff to ask any follow-up questions. So don't hesitate to contact us.
All right. Do we have any more discussion, comments? Megan and Patrick, do you have what you need to get started, to run with it?
We're gonna run.
And you're going to run fast, too. All right. Anything else to bring before the committee? Seeing nothing, can I have a motion for adjournment?
Motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
All right. Thank you, Terry, Dennis, Chiefs, and Joe. and to all the committee members, thank you for being present for the meeting. We are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Wow.
everybody.
Everybody.